right now we are going to have an amazing bunch of characters join us. Basically, as a somebody who shoots all the time, one of the biggest problems that I always find is we need like a liaison between producers and aerial cinematography companies, because typically the way production works is, hey, I need this shot, I need it shot tomorrow. And that's not at all how drones work. I mean, we could do it that way, but it's just not how it works because of the FAA and whatnot. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna bring these people out, a bunch of really awesome people, knowledgeable in all different realms, and we're gonna talk about this topic and try to clear the air and make it clear for everybody, not only on stage, but for you guys as well. So I'd like to welcome out Lori Landau and Mark Knott from Fox Rothschild. What's up? Miss Maria Stephanopoulos from Good Morning America. Hey, baby. And once again, Mr. Brian Walk. Cool. So basically, as you guys heard before, I mean, using drones is just, obviously knowing how to use them, knowing how to use them creatively is just one element. And then there's the whole aspect of interfacing with production companies, producers, the law, the FAA, all these kind of things, local jurisdictions and whatnot. So maybe we can just start again by each person introducing yourselves, talk about your strengths and about your experience with dealing with drones.
Hi, everybody. I'm Maria Stephanopoulos with ABC News, and I, about 13 months ago, saw a video that Eric Chang took in Iceland when he flew his Phantom drone over a volcano, and my bosses came up to me and said, hey, we want to do this. And I was like, cool. They said live. I'm like, oh, shit. Never worked with drones before. We, through many trials and tribulations during a rehearsal the day before our live event, found out that it was a much harder piece of equipment to interface with than we expected, for a number of reasons, which we may or may not get into later. But I left Iceland being bitten by the drone bug, and about 2 weeks later, I came to this event, totally accidentally, and walked in like a dumb girl, like, oh, this is gonna be cool, and left like, oh my God, something big is really happening in the world of production. So I'm a self-proclaimed news and drone junkie. I'm a huge supporter of this tool that has changed my life and journalists' life forever. And I love being able to bring a story to our viewers in a way like they've never seen before. So we have a lot to talk about today.
Good Morning America also, by the way, has a film in competition this year, which is really amazing. It's a really awesome film.
And it was all live.
Which, like, does anybody here work in live TV? All right, so you guys know, like, regular terrestrial live TV is a bear on its own, let alone when you're talking about drones. So yeah, we'll delve into that a little bit more. Mark, Lori?
Well, you heard from me earlier, if you're on the panel earlier, but I mean, it's an exciting area, I mean, for anybody. And from a legal perspective, it's exciting. And I don't like to have to tell clients no. I like to say, okay, let's figure out a way to do this. And there's so many aspects that, from the legal perspective, that this touches on. And when it comes to more the nuts and bolts production side, that's when I would turn to somebody like Lori. I mean, my focus is more on just the drone-specific legal side than on the production side. But of course, those are the issues that you run into if you want to do the production side.
And so on the production side, I'm an entertainment lawyer, I'm a production counsel, and I work with independent filmmakers and producers and really help them from concept through to distribution, from the beginning when they're looking for financing and helping them to map out what the course is to get their film made and then what goes into it. So from my end, insofar as drone work is concerned, it's really just another newer component for filmmakers in terms of what do they have to consider by way of budget, by way of clearances, by way of permits, by way of licenses, considering locations and all of these things that figure into what it is that they're doing. So that's where I come in, and then to the extent that there's any real drone-related permits and things that go along with that, a lot of what we've heard of before is when I would turn to Mark and say, this is really, in your wheelhouse.
Brian? What about you? Have you ever dealt with the FAA before?
Oh, once or twice. One of my aspects of some of the things I do for Randy are, you already brought it up, like Huntsville. I wrote a site-specific COA for NASA's, what's it called again?
Let's set it up. So a job came up where we were doing a live production for Good Morning America, and basically we were next to a military base, and also there was another overlapping airspace.
Yeah, it was Class D airspace from Redstone Redstone Army Air Base.
Yeah, so basically in the Venn diagram, we were in a double jeopardy, crappy situation. Thankfully, though, due to his skill set in terms of appeasing the FAA and talking to them in the way that they need to be spoken to, we got approval. We had a site-specific COA for that.
One of the things is integrating, production versus where, oh yeah, why can't I go fly over there just because there's space and, there's sky above everybody? Why you can't always fly in all of that? There are, in this particular instance, there is Class D airspace, which has equipment requirements and weather requirements. And depending on what equipment you have allows you to fly in this particular airspace, which for this one was really only a two-way radio communications problem. For entering the Class D airspace, you need to have two-way radio communication with the tower. And as many of you know, VHF is line of sight. There was a mountain in between, and it was working with the FAA, and Redstone actually put a repeater that they had on top of the mountain so that we could talk to them, which satisfied our two-way radio communications with the tower requirement. And basically from there, it was just filling in the blanks and making sure that the paperwork was the FAA wants to see on page 1, they want to see 1, 2, and 3, and on page 2, they want to see 4, 5, and 6. You better make sure that 1, 2, and 3 is on page 1, 4, 5, 6 is on page 2, not the other way around. They lay things in a specific order, and the big thing is they want to mitigate risk. In aviation, every rule, every regulation is written somewhere in blood because there was a problem, there's an accident, somewhere somebody got hurt. And the FAA's main concern is, what are you doing to prevent more accidents or more incidents from occurring? And that's part of why there's so much paperwork. And I don't know if many of you have Exemption 333s. There's a ton of paperwork that's involved with it. And that's why.
On that shoot, we actually also asked for a special exemption because technically you're only allowed to fly 200 feet, but we wanted to go 400 because of the nature of the broadcast. So I remember we were able to get that, which was
Forgot about that
super
part.
helpful. Yeah.
Top of the rocket was 396 feet.
Saturn 4.
Brian, I just want you to talk a little bit more because we talk about this all the time. Obviously, dealing with the FAA is a tricky task. And the interesting part about it, as you were saying before, is that there has to be a certain amount of protocol and you have to be speaking their language. So if you can, for everybody, can you give your best advice on how to talk to these people?
You want the crayons version?
Yes.
The easiest way to do it is, I'm smart, you're smart, I'm dumb, and tell me what I'm doing wrong to make sure that we can make it work for you. It seems to work a lot of times, is be as humble as humanly possible. Don't go in there, it doesn't matter who you are. If you're Chuck Yeager or some student pilot, don't go in with a chip on your shoulder. Go in going, this is what I want to do. How can we work together to get it done? And, no matter how much you think you know, there's always something that their interpretation of the law, somebody's going to read it differently. There's the spirit of the law and then the law itself. And unfortunately, it gets interpreted a little bit differently depending on who you deal with. There are some FSDOs, particularly one in the New York area, that if you submit a plan of action, they'll give you approval or not. And according to the exemption, that's not required. If you go to a different one, let's say in Albany, it's a completely different process of how you submit your plan of action and what they do with it. They don't even send an email back. They go, okay, great, we got it, if you call. Another one, closer one in the New York area, they want to see maps, they want to see risk analysis, they want to see things above and beyond the plan of action. And again, the easiest thing to do is just, okay, tell me what you want and I'll provide it. By saying, I don't need to do that, now you're digging yourself a hole. Don't dig yourself a hole. Just be as kind and polite as possible because these people deal with a lot of arrogant, a lot of unhumble people. And if you get their back, you need them more than they need you, is essentially how I work it.
And I think that's a great point is just because you did it in a certain way 5 other times doesn't mean that that particular governing place is going to let you do it that way. And rather than, shove it in their face that, well, I've always done it this way. If they want it done a certain way, do it the way they want it done. It's much easier, trust me, to do it the way they want it done and ask them what they want to see.
Ultimately, it's going to be better for your project and therefore better for your bottom line. Because if they say no, the answer is no, which means you no longer can, participate in said action.
Well,
And they
and just-
also remember who you are. They remember each time, oh, you're the guy with the spelling mistakes, or you're the guy, I spoke to you last week. If you do enough of these, there's only 2 or 3 people in every FSDO that really deal with the UAS. Sorry, I stepped on you.
No, I was just going to echo what you're saying, but I think, again, from a production standpoint, it's really no different than so many other hurdles that get thrown in your way when you're trying to produce something. And I think it's a matter of not getting too intimidated by the fact that it may be new to you or different, and you learn the more times you're going to do anything. But anytime you're doing a production and you have to get permits and you have to get licenses and you have to get location clearances and you have to really think through all of the rights that you're going to have to secure along the way. You just think of that as being another one in the mix, but one that may need a little bit more lead time or may need a certain amount of additional thinking for other reasons. But I would say, as anything else, it's just trying to think of it in terms of everything else that you're planning.
And then take all of this and talk to an executive producer at a morning show who doesn't take no for an answer. And that's exactly what I think we're all here to talk about, how complicated it could be to use drones in production. Because I may have a location. For example, I had a location in Austin, Texas. We wanted to go live, don't judge, from the world's biggest slide. And we couldn't because it was too close to an airport. And our executive producer's like, I don't care. And I'm like, yeah, you do. You can't go live. And so, it's really hard to try to use this amazing new tool in an industry where no isn't acceptable all the time.
Yeah, and I mean, another problem with that is that, certain companies care, but others don't. And we, every person that has a 333 here and those that don't, they get the work that we can't get because they'll just do it. Which, it is what it is. That's just the way it goes. But
Exactly.
so tell me a little bit about what you encounter when you're dealing with things internally, because one of the things that I constantly deal with is producers who work for big companies that and they're like, no, our legal team doesn't let that. It doesn't allow it. That stuff is changing, but for a long time that's the way it was, and we still see that.
It's really hard, to be honest with you. I think working for the #1 morning show on network television right now, we are constantly pushing the envelope. And not to toot ABC's horn, but we have done a very good job pulling off ambitious projects using drones live. And we are the only broadcaster who has pulled off these crazy ideas, going live from volcanoes, Sundong Cave, glaciers, and the Serengeti just a week ago. But it's really hard because our producers are used to everyone, people call and we're like, we're from Good Morning America, and everybody stops. They're like, oh, sure, what do you want? What do you want? But unfortunately, it doesn't work that way with this technology. And one of the problems I usually face is I deal with producers who don't have the time to educate themselves and truly understand how drones work and all of the parameters that we need to work around in order to use them in our productions. But they also are used to an industry with GoPro and iPhones and LiveView where you plug and play. And this is definitely not plug and play. And so one thing that I always hear is, I want to go live tomorrow from a beach, or they're building dunes for this storm that's approaching, the one that I called you about a couple of months ago, and I want to go live tomorrow, and it's 5 p.m. And I'm like, well, it's 5 p.m. You know that we have a 3-day, they're like, 3 days. 3 hours is enough notice for us. And they're like, I don't understand why. And I said, okay, great, but for live, we need to get a satellite truck. We need to get an engineer who's gonna hook up the decimator to convert from 60 frames to 59.94, a standards converter as well, because this amazing consumer product is not broadcast standard ready yet. And so you can't just plug and play. And so for us, the difference between the millions of hours of drone footage that I've seen is that almost all of it was done in post-production or finished in post. And in my world, that's not, that I don't have that option or that luxury. And so we get one shot. We have a hit time that we need to meet. And so if you're not ready at 7:06 a.m. Eastern, and Randy knows exactly what I'm talking about, and you miss that window, then the show moves on. There is no second chance. And so, you know, from a producer standpoint, editorially speaking, they're like, I want a drone tomorrow, 7:06 a.m. Eastern. What time does the sun rise? 7:49. You can't fly before 20 minutes before the sun comes up. And so our rehearsal time is,
1 hour.
I thought it was 20 minutes. Well, good to know. See, even I learned something here. So anyway, so we have so many limitations, and they don't care. They don't care. And so as a production manager, it's my job to care, or it will not make air. And so the limitations are the technology, you know, is where it is. The FAA isn't moving fast enough. We have to work within all of these crazy parameters. And sorry, I think some of them are really crazy. And hopefully they change within the next year so that we can all safely and responsibly use them more.
Yeah, I mean, like, look, they're obviously responding slowly to an explosion of new elements in their airspace. So it's understandable why they're doing what they're doing. It doesn't make our job any easier, but I think they will change.
Especially when you get a call at 5 o'clock for 7:06 the next morning to get paperwork
I know.
done.
Yeah.
The government closes at 3. That's also a major problem. You know, it's you know, yes, can you do it tomorrow? Yeah, but can you legally do it tomorrow? No. And it's teaching news or any production company, you know, unfortunately time is a problem. You know, as I've so learned that, you know, 1 day is an eternity in production. You know, 3 days might as well be 10 years from now. And that's, you know, the regulation's not written like that. You need, you know, 3 days a minimum of time for them to respond to you, and that's a big mountain, a hurdle we need to cross.
Which is funny because a lot of the FAA regulation is meant to keep it's meant to keep people safe, right? And the
Absolutely.
reality is, professional operators are the most conscientious in that entire drone flying world, and we are not going that high. We're not doing stupid things because we want to work more. You know, one crashed drone live on Good Morning America, and you'd probably never hire my company again. And it's like you need to. There's a certain responsibility when you're dealing with that kind of stuff, and that's just the reality of it. Let me ask you a question. So, what would you say to a producer now if you were going to be instructing a new producer on what the best practices are, best considerations in terms of a checklist? What things would you put on that checklist so that the producer would know this is what I have to take care of before I would engage with an aerial cinematography provider?
So there are two things. One is internally. At ABC, we have a pretty strict drone policy where you can't just hire somebody off the street, even if they have a 333 exemption. You have to, there's like a Disney agreement that both parties have to sign. We have a certain insurance requirement that sometimes takes a day or multiple days for the vendor to get. I think it's $5 million. And we have to have the vendor go through risk management at Disney, rights and clearances, and our drone unit, which is spearheaded by our Vice President of Operations. And so once we vet the vendor and we trust that they are the right person that we should be working with based on their history and based on the requirements that we ask for and that they provide, once that's out of the way, I usually tell producers that, you know, the most important thing is to be safe, and it's exactly what you said. If you're on a big project and the vendor doesn't have some sort of meeting with the crew or doesn't make you feel comfortable that he is going to listen to you when you say, please don't fly 600 feet. If we get in trouble, you are going to walk away from your job and work for other people. But that might mean that I can never use a drone again on my air. And so I think trust is number one. And it's no secret that we work with EO drones a lot, and it's because we speak the same language. And my job is to protect my show and to make sure that I'm working with somebody who understands that if a producer comes in and is like, no, 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 get closer, and you're like, no, you are in command, and by you messing up means that, the consequences on ABC and our partner or our owner, Disney, I mean, the repercussions would be huge. And so working within the parameters is number one.
Something that I think is really important for sure on the side of the aerial cinematographers is you must assert yourself, and it's like often we've been on set with big name directors, big name producers, big name cinematographers, but the reality is once that blender starts flying, it's like it doesn't matter what kind of egos are around. It's like you must assert yourself. You must make sure that the safety discussion happens. And it's like no matter how many times I tell somebody not to talk to my pilot, they will in the middle of the flight. And it's like I have to, if we have to land it, if we have to, we just have to be really aggressive about it on our side, because the reality is that if something bad happens, it's really bad. But in general, it looks bad for everybody anytime anybody gets hurt. It's always on the news, like that skier that, that almost got hit by that drone. Jesus.
Yeah, one thing I will say is that I feel like drones have become so easy to fly nowadays that, everyone has one and every kid is playing with one. And I feel like for people who are uneducated in the world of production, they feel like our producers, our production assistants can just get some sort of training and just take a drone out and fly it. And I just make sure that everyone is aware that it's we have to respect this device because somebody can, as you said, get hurt. And one of the hardest parts of my job, I feel like I have to sort of tread lightly every time I call a venue saying that we want to use a drone, because the word drone is scary to people. I just got back from Africa, and it took about a week and a half for us to convince the government of Tanzania that we are not a military operation spying on the rhinoceros population that may or may not be thriving in a certain part of the country. And they were like, I specifically stated what we were using and sent them pictures, and they were like, no. And so I found out later that, the word drone, it doesn't matter. They don't keep reading. A lot of people get stuck on that word, and unfortunately, it has a negative connotation. And so I feel like I'm always sort of tiptoeing around that when I talk to people.
I had lunch with the vice president for MGM Casinos. MGM controls 60% of the casinos probably in Las Vegas. So, I mean, they are a huge player. And he said, we have a policy. We never permit drones on our property for any reason whatsoever, and we will never change that. But that was the perception. Now, certainly, they will change it once they understand it, but that's the view of the world by a lot of people. And to circle back to what we touched on earlier, I mean, you're all part of the public perception and changing that perception. 99% of the population or more, they have two views of the world. One, it's going to invade my privacy, or two, when am I going to be able to get that Domino's pizza? And beyond that, they can't appreciate everything else that drones can do.
Except when they fly one, by the way. Because as soon as they fly one, they're all converted. I'm sure everybody has experienced that. It's like, oh, drones, I'm so scared of them. I don't know what they are. And then as soon as you put the controller in somebody's hands, they love it until they crash it. And then they go out and they buy one.
And I was just going to say that I would virtually guarantee that your in-house legal department, if they had any idea that there was anybody talking about using an assistant or somebody else to fly a drone, they would never let that happen.
That's not true, because we have
Really?
drone school starting on March 14th.
And your legal department is aware of it?
Yes.
That is shocking for me for ABC.
Brian knows the instructor very
That's
well.
amazing.
Yeah,
And so
it's
are
actually
they actually, what are they doing by way of making sure that that certification is happening and training is happening? Are they handling all the permits on their
Hired
side?
an external organization to help us with that.
Really? That's awesome. But this is, but
142 equivalent.
But they're making sure there are trained people. I mean, you were talking about having people who were just in your, standing around being able to do it.
So in order for somebody like a production assistant to be able to fly a Phantom 3 or a 4 or an Inspire, they'd have to go through this training course.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Interesting.
Yep. But I actually don't think that should be open to anybody, because I think they should be hand-selected, and luckily they are. I think only a handful of people have gone through our training, and another 4 will be going through next week.
That's awesome, actually.
And the training is very important. I mean, just because you can fly, I mean, I'm sure everybody here can fly one or has flown one at some point in time. But the difference is that makes it safe is your aeronautical decision making, and that only comes through good training. It's not just from a YouTube video or a fly-by-night operation. It's flying a multi-copters. If you treat it like a real airplane, you'll never have a problem, or you'll reduce the amount of problems you could potentially have. Aeronautical decision making is not just if I press the stick forward, it goes forward, and there's a tree there, I should go around it. It's considering, oh, what's the wind today? What are the limitations on the craft that I'm flying? Are there people nearby? It's a risk assessment. It's just because I can do this, should I do it? It's all those factors go into making a good decision, which inevitably leads to a safe flight.
And once again, I think that also comes down to being able to assert yourself. It doesn't matter. It's hard because, I feel like as production service providers, we're always put in this position where it's like you want to appease your client. Now in terrestrial, cinematography and terrestrial production, it's like, sure, most things you could just do, no problem. But in aerial cinematography, there are those considerations, and they are steep.
Absolutely, and you should always be thinking a crash is going to happen. Just always be thinking it can potentially happen. What's going to happen, and if it happens now, what am I going to do? If it happens 5 minutes from now, what am I going to do? It's always thinking, preparing, removing for the future. I mean, it's really gravity always wins.
I'd like to, since we're at the film festival, I guess I want to talk a little bit about vetting vendors for their skills. Because I think, you can get a 333 and you can be an RC hobbyist or an RC professional of some sort and get a 333. Doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to be able to be an aerial cinematographer in that kind of like grander sense. I mean, there's a lot of amazing disparate skills that you all know goes into this, right? I mean, you have to understand everything about cinematography. You have to understand about natural lighting, about wind conditions, about flying the actual aircraft, all these kind of things. So what do you guys think about that and about vetting those kind of vendors?
So I look for three things when I scout or look for a vendor, try to recruit one, and it's the perfect drone pilot to me or drone team has the technical knowledge of their device. So some sort of, not necessarily an IT background, but some sort of technical background to be able to troubleshoot their machine when there's a problem. If they have a problem with the frequency that they're operating on and need to work around it or whatever may happen technically, I need somebody to fully understand what they're using and flying. Then the second thing is they need to be a good pilot. For me, it's really hard to get my company to sign off on spending X amount of dollars on a 30-second live shot if it just looks like an aerial still shot. I personally believe that drones are used the best under 200 feet. I think, I have to convince people, I'm sorry, our audience is from Middle America, which we all love, but a lot of people have never used drones or don't know what the difference between a helicopter shot and a drone is. And so for someone to be a good pilot and to give me what I'm looking for, a sweeping shot, a flyby, whatever it is important to me. And number three, I need somebody with a cinematographer's eye. I can learn how to fly a drone in an hour, but that definitely doesn't mean I'll be good in any way. And I don't have a cinematographer's eye, but it's important to me to have somebody with all three, and that's pretty hard to find.
Just to hit on something that you mentioned before and that Brian says all the time and I mentioned earlier is that, when you want to hammer a nail, you need a hammer. And often people will say to me, hey, we want you to shoot this or that. And I'm like, that is the perfect, that's, a helicopter should do that. If you want a shot, flying up the East River and you want to cover it over a certain amount of space, that's designed for a helicopter at that height, especially in this airspace, right? Same thing, there's certain kind of shots that are way better as a Steadicam shot than as a drone shot. And when it comes down to the approvals and all that other stuff, it just makes sense. So I think another thing when it comes to production is you just have to pick the right tool for the right job. And drones are certainly an amazing tool that have a lot of flexibility and give us views in a whole new way, but they have to be used correctly.
Yeah, and I always say, why do you want to use a drone? To our executive, and he's like, well, it's cool. No, I don't believe in just using it to say we're using it. my theory is if we're going to hire a drone, we're going to use it as a Steadicam, a jib, and a helicopter. And so if we can do all three with the subject we're shooting or with the story we're shooting, then it's a go.
Well, I think that really raises a good point, and kind of going back to what do you look at. So from a business perspective, which is different from a creative perspective, from a business perspective, you're also going to be looking at, what's the bang for the buck, right? In terms of, are you really getting value for your dollar? Whether or not it's a real, legitimate, and trustworthy company, are they going to be able to stand behind the work on every level, particularly if something goes wrong? So if you're on that end of things, where you are doing that risk assessment, that's going to be part of what you're looking at. Not only, and mostly, obviously, can you deliver creatively, but if you don't have everything else to back it up, then it may not be the right choice for a production.
And I think you know pretty quickly. We've dealt with some vendors who are like, what? Or, or you should fly my S1000. We will bring that for a shoot. And I'm like, the conversation is over. Obviously, we would, for our purposes in news, it's not something we would ever really need. And so I think once you start talking to people, again, like you mentioned, getting a 333 is so easy. But I think within the first minute of my conversations with vendors around the country, I know whether this is going to work or not.
Yeah, if you see warning flags early,
Yep.
time to throw in the towel.
Sure.
Definitely. So, from a legal perspective, I'd like to hear from you guys about what do you think a conscientious producer should be paying attention to on the legal side? What elements come up legally when it comes to drones? I mean, obviously we have liability issues, and we also, Lori, you and I were talking about when you're shooting something. Well, you have a shot of a certain landscape, and there's certain elements within the frame that you may or may not have rights to. What kind of elements in that capacity?
Well, I mean, and again, this is not drone specific per se. I mean, this is really with respect to, when you're planning your shots generally, when you have that from the beginning, you have to think about what's in the frame, how focused are you on it? Is it incidental? Is it something that you need to clear? Is it something that's been trademarked? Is it subject to some sort of other protection? So, how, in terms of people who might be in the frames, and again, depending on how the drones are being used, you have to worry about getting releases from different individuals. None of this is new in terms of production. It's just a question of the tool that's being used to capture the images. So I think from that end of things, there's a host of things that any producer has to be concerned about, but they need to really confront those issues up front. And that's part of the process as far as sitting down on the creative side with your director and with your script, and depending on whatever it is that you're doing, and with your crew and your technical people and your cinematographer, your director of photography and everything else, and saying, okay, here's what I need. Can we do it? And what is it going to cost me? And how hard is it going to be to clear it down the road? And that's putting aside the licenses and permits and all those things that you want to make sure that you have that really buttoned up. I don't remember, somebody was talking about it on a previous panel, but if you get to the end of the road and then it turns out that you're like, you've done all this work, you've invested all this money, you've hired all these incredible people, and then you're going to your distributor, and you as a producer are going to have to stand behind this product and say, I did everything the way I was supposed to. I got every clearance, I was licensed, I had everything, and then it turns out that you didn't, right? Or that you relied on somebody who said they did, but they didn't. And then that comes out, well, then you potentially are losing your distribution deal, and anybody who invested in your film or whatever else that you're creating is going to have a big problem with that too. So now you're facing potential liability on the investor side on top of everything else. So it can be very, it can be very serious in terms of what you do.
Let me ask you a question from a legal perspective, because, I mean, let's be real. There's a lot of fudging going on when it comes down to this kind of stuff. I mean, I'm sure not for, obviously not for ABC, and not for a lot of companies, but there's a lot of people. How many people here have shot, some small production with a Phantom or an Inspire or whatever that, it's like you didn't get clearance, you didn't, it's like everybody has. What are the legal ramifications of that if somebody wants to, hey, I'm going to use my Phantom to shoot somebody's music video?
Well, you've got the FAA in there who can take a very aggressive stance if they want. And, I mean...
Do they?
I
mean, aside from Perker and from and what's the Skypan International?
Not so much, but and I think a big part of that is, it's difficult for them to say, we don't have the resources and the staff to get the regulations in place and do everything that we need to do, and yet we're out here taking a very aggressive enforcement stance. That doesn't mean that it's not there. And I think, so it's not only how it can affect you in the future. I mean, I'll make a quick comparison. To a certain extent, I do a little bit of stuff, some of my partners do quite a bit more in the medical marijuana industry. And it's a startup where you have a lot of people out there doing stuff. Particularly in California, you've got a lot of people who pushed the envelope ahead of time. Unfortunately, although they were the trailblazers, they're probably going to get left behind. They may not get the permits because they look at them and you violated the law. You might have created what the industry is today, but you violated the law. You don't want to be in that area of getting left behind because you didn't comply with what you were supposed to comply with. So the question is, are you in it for the short term or are you in it for the long term? And if it's a short-term perspective, you're probably more willing to bend the rules. But if you're looking at this as something, this is your reputation on the line, and it's both sides of the spectrum. Because I advise clients as well on the side of hiring drone operators. They're not going to operate the drone, just like what Maria talks about with ABC, hiring somebody to do the filming for them. Whatever it might be, somebody gathering data or otherwise, here are all the things you need to look at on the checklist. And a lot of it's what Maria mentioned is, and do the red flags come up? And then when you're on the operation side, you want to make sure that you don't get pushed into pushing the envelope of where you feel comfortable and assert yourself and say, no, we can't do it, we're not going to do it because of X, Y, and Z. So I think it's, while there's legal aspects to it, it's a lot of common sense and how is this going to look? If something doesn't work out with what is being proposed here and it all goes south, what am I going to have to live with as a result of that?
By the way, one of my favorite tricks on production, if you want to assert yourself but you don't want to be the one that's at fault, is you just blame it on the FAA. So it's like I've used that in 1,000 different ways. From everything like the producer standing too close to me. I'm like, sorry, the FAA does not allow you to stand within 10 feet of us. And when we're performing an operation, I always find that funny.
Scapegoat.
And then they just split.
Yeah, they're a great scapegoat.
Yeah. I mean, you could just use that for most anything. Thank you very much to our panel, Integrating Drones into Production.